Hello and good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's session of the Dublin Economics Workshop at Dublin Econ. You can also find us on for debate and those on Twitter, hashtag DEW 2021. The seminar today, as are all the seminars during the week, are sponsored by Dublin Chamber of Commerce at DubCham. So we've a really super lineup of speakers for you this afternoon between 1 and 2:30. So I'm going to get on with it and just set the context and then introduce our first speaker. I invite you, by the way, throughout to submit your questions to our panelists in the Q&A box that you have available to you. And that'll give the speakers and the panelists a chance to think about their response, and they'll come up in the Q&A session at the very end. So the topic for today is it time to rethink Ireland's economic model? In addressing this question, I'm going to share something with you. It's my birthday today and my son is sick. So if you pass another year and you've got illness in your family or whatever, it is a time for reflection. I'm going to call it a retreat. So similarly for the economy itself, we've just had a bit of an illness. We were sick about a decade ago as well. So I think it is time and a good time to begin to reflect and think about where we are, where we're going, where we have been, and the future. In this regard, obviously COVID has given us quite a number of challenges. Yesterday, we talked about the future of work and what that means post-COVID, the future of cities. But as one civil servant pointed out to me, it'd be good to get back to some of the old problems that we have. So we can always look forward to that. But of course, the old world isn't there anymore. The world we're going back to is a new world. It's not the same. We have had changes that COVID has made itself. We have international tax changes plenty. And we've had Brexit. We have a new relationship effectively with the EU, a new dynamic in the EU, certainly. Questions around digitalization trends, sustainability, and everything else. So that's one big area that's kind of all the macro question. Within that, one real particular challenge, I think, particularly in the context of international tax developments, is focusing on what do we do with enterprise policy. And Ireland, although not alone in this, has suffered from weak productivity growth for a number of years, particularly amongst indigenous firms. So it's a perennial problem. What can technology do to help us? What can management do to help us? Well, this is a problem we really need to get to the bottom of, and something we need to solve. Finally, as we enter sort of the long tail of COVID, the supports that we've enjoyed have been hugely beneficial in keeping firms afloat and keeping the welfare of people connected, keeping people's welfare and keeping them connected to their employment. But how does that unwound? What does that mean for enterprise policy? What does it mean for the large level of unemployment that Ireland faces? How can we get that number down? These are the questions we're going to look at in the session. First up, I have Professor John van Reenen. I'm very welcome to Professor John van Reenen today. John is the Ronald Coase Professor at the London School of Economics. He's also a digital fellow at the Initiative for the Digital Economy at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, where he's just stepped down as a professor there, and also at the Sloan School of Management. John has over 100 papers to his name on a whole range of topics, firm performance and innovation being the foremost. He has a daunting list of fellowships and awards, not least of which is an OBE for his services to public policy and economics. And I'm just thinking to my colleagues here in Ireland, we'll have to find one of those that we can award here. Maybe it's one for the DEW. So over to you, John.
Okay, thank you very much for that overly kind introduction. I'm delighted to be able to share some thoughts with you today on the kind of recovery after COVID and beyond. I have to get my apologies in early. I'm not an expert on Irish economic policy, so I'm going to kind of step back and give a more global type of perspective. But I think many of these issues, and we can get this as a discussion, relate to Ireland as they do for many other kind of countries in the world. And I say I'm disappointed I can't actually be in Dublin today. My wife is actually from Dublin in Glenageary, so I always love the chance to actually get back to go to Dublin in the flesh. I hope we get a chance to that soon. Anyway, so I'm going to talk a bit about the challenge, a little bit about why I think the answer to that challenge has to be through pushing productivity growth, then how to understand growth, and then think about a kind of a growth plan for Europe, Ireland, and around the world. So the argument I'm going to make is basically very, very simple. I mean, we face this unprecedented growth challenge due to the pandemic. And, I think when we think about this, COVID has actually revealed many of the existing weaknesses which are already there in our economies and in our politics. And I'm going to show you that, the world had many economic problems going into the pandemic, or this low productivity growth has already been mentioned, and weak labor markets. And my view is that when we think about the policy framework, it should be unashamedly around trying to get back to growth, but growth which is more equitable and environmentally sustainable than it has been in the past. So it's not just productivity growth, it's the right kind of productivity growth. So when we think about how to get to productivity growth, there's two key things. One is the kind of innovation, pushing the frontier of knowledge forward, and the other is diffusion, the spread of those ideas more quickly around the economy. And when I think about that, I think of not just the kind of narrow technologies. It's not just about the robots and the computers and the AI. It's also about management practices, and that's one of the things I'm going to talk about. I think a key thing is how those new technologies are managed and organized by people, by workers and firms. I'm going to share that's absolutely critical in order to get sustainable growth. We actually know quite a lot about what to do. There's a lot of research I'm going to draw on, and my view is that the world, needs a kind of almost like a new Marshall Plan for growth, like we had after the Second World War. In the short run, that needs the balance between protecting the people and our economies as we have done. But as we move out of that, we have to think about how to reallocate our resources away from some of the old industries to the new industries, the old jobs to the new jobs, particularly around thinking about the climate change challenge, for example, into green jobs and away from dirty jobs. So I think we can frame a growth plan around this mission. Climate's one, but there's also health missions, think about vaccines, also strategic issues, in order to kind of pull many of these policies together around innovation in order to create a new opportunity. I think vaccines give us the opportunity. What we need now is policy urgency to get the job done. Okay, so here's the challenge. This is looking at EU and Euro area growth rates since 2008. So those of us who lived through the global financial crisis, I remember we were all saying, this is a once in a lifetime big negative shock. Well, look what happened. Recently, in 2020, we had falls of growth of like 16%, so dwarfing what happened in the global financial crisis. Now, luckily, the recovery seems to be quicker than it was, but that's not guaranteed, and these numbers are changing. So, the scale of the challenge we face really is quite phenomenal. But the thing to remember is that the challenge we face isn't simply what's just happened over the last couple of years. If you look over the longer run, so what this shows you in this graph is productivity growth, what economists call total productivity growth. So it's the it's the part of growth when you've taken out the inputs of people and capital. So it's how efficiently you're using your resources, often measured measure of technological progress. You can see that in the main countries in Europe, there was a very fast recovery after the Second World War, when productivity growth was zooming ahead at about 4% in the 25 years after the Second World War. Then we had the oil crisis, and productivity growth kind of more than halved. And then we had the period in the mid-90s, the mid 2000s, when it fell again. And then finally, since 2005 onwards, we've had very, very low productivity growth, down to 1/3 of a percentage point a year. If we compare that to the US, of course, wasn't as damaged by the Second World War as Europe was. So it had slower growth all the way through to the mid-1990s. But then the US did have this kind of pickup of productivity growth in the kind of period when IT and computer prices were falling very rapidly, and we had the growth of the internet. But just like Europe, since 2005, the US has had low productivity growth, not as low as Europe, but still pretty low. So that's the challenge. So even going in to our crisis, we had a serious productivity challenge. So you might say, well, why is productivity growth important? And not all of you, I think, in the audience are economists. Economists take it for granted, but I think most people don't take it for granted. There's lots of challenges that I often face when I go around the world talking about the importance of growth. One view is that all the benefits of growth go to capitalists and not workers. Well, but in fact, if you look at the countries which have had faster productivity growth, they've also tended to have faster wage growth. So wages and productivity growth in the long run tend to go together. So, if you really want to, it's really about the increasing the size of the economic pie. If you don't increase the pie, just giving more and more wages is just going to create inflation. Secondly, people always say, well, growth is inevitably going to lead to more inequality. And I just don't think that's true. There's many countries which have low levels of inequality. Think about the Northern European countries like Sweden or Norway, which have low inequality and yet very high productivity. A third challenge is it inevitable that growth is bad for the environment? Now, of course, it can be. So if you have growth, which is just using more fossil fuels, that is can create an environmental challenge. But I think if we want to deal with climate change, for example, we're not going to do that just by raising taxes on carbon and regulation. We also need innovation. We need green innovation, which is going to create new technologies in order to help us deal with climate change. So if you think about productivity growth, what that gives you is the opportunity to do more with less. So we can actually more efficiently produce things without necessarily making them bad for the environment. The fourth challenge, and this is my friend Richard Layard, who I succeeded at the Centre for Economic Performance in London a couple of decades ago. He emphasizes that growth, more money doesn't necessarily make you happier, which is absolutely true. However, as my Auntie Lorraine said, money doesn't bring you happiness, but it certainly makes your misery easier to bear. And I think there's a lot of truth in that, being in poverty and having a low amount of material goods is not something which is good for well-being. So although growth is not the only thing about well-being, obviously, it is an important factor that we would like to restore. I think the biggest challenge to my emphasis on growth is that, this is something we can do. So there's a lot of pessimism around, sometimes I think this is like the new normal, that it's very, there's not, those growth rates, those productivity growth rate patterns I showed you, there's just nothing we can do about it. And this is often, this is the traditional economic view, in fact, that productivity growth happens and, it's like manna from heaven. There's nothing you can really do. Robert Gordon is a kind of, a friend of mine, but he's a kind of propounder of this view that, the aging population, other factors means that we have to get used to poor productivity growth. My friend and colleague Philippe Aghion takes the other view, and I'm of this view, which is in fact that there are things that we can do, that you can get better productivity if you change your policies, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that is the case. So I'm more optimistic that there are things, there are innovation policies, there are policies towards management where we can actually get some improvements in our growth rate. I think the evidence supports that more optimistic view. Okay, so let's get to understanding a little bit more about growth and what productivity growth is. So as I said, I think if we think about the long history of growth, it's really a story of innovation rather than a story just of the accumulation of people or even the accumulation of capital. When the Industrial Revolution happened, there was this kind of takeoff of growth, and it took off without, as happened in the past, population increasing and people falling into poverty. It was technology which helped spur that kind of growth. So, for example, this is my colleague MIT, Bob Solow, who won the Nobel Prize for this analysis. Bob looked at output growth in the US, productivity growth in the US. That's been about, as I showed you, about 2.5 percentage points on average since the Second World War. If you break that down, 2% of that 2.5%, so 80%, is due to this total factor productivity, or what's sometimes called the Solow residual, efficiency improvements. Some of that is increases of skills, some of this is increases of capital, but the majority is to do with technology, to do with innovation. So innovation really is key. But when we think about TFP growth, we should think broadly about innovation. So one part for advanced countries like Ireland is pushing that frontier of knowledge forward, which is very important. But there's still lots of room for improvement of productivity without those kind of, those technological innovations which are completely new to the world. So one is the spread of those technologies. So not necessarily having to, invent the newest computer or newest robot, actually to spread those technologies around the economy to adopt best practice. And another way is actually to reduce misallocation. And what we mean by misallocation is that in all economies, often you find that too little market share goes to the most productive firms. So economies which tend to be more successful are the ones which are more dynamic, which allow the more productive, more efficient, better managed firms to grow, and the less efficient and productive ones to decline. And if ways of trying to improve that process of reallocation can actually be a way of improving productivity without needing, frontier innovation or the spread of new technologies. So all these things are important when we think about growth policies which are effective. So what are the two fundamental sources of growth that we can think of? So, on the one hand, there's kind of the hard technologies, the kind of robots. And on the other hand, I think there's a way that there's the management practices in firms. So I put Adam Smith down as Pin Factory, as Toyota, it's modern kind of management practices in the Toyota plant. So I don't think many of you need convincing that technology is important. So as I mentioned, if we think about the takeoff of growth in the Western world, it started off with the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th century under steam power. It moved through in the end of the 19th century. It's an amazing year of 1879, where there were these innovations in luminosity by Edison, in mobility by Carl Benz, and in communication by David Edward Hughes. And that second Industrial Revolution, the waves of that spread out into the 20th century. The third industrial revolution was around the mid-1990s, around the internet, around digital technologies. There was a rapid improvement of quality. And many people now think we're living through a fourth industrial revolution, built around artificial intelligence, around robotics, around new forms of therapies and health. Think about vaccines as an example of an amazing technology which we managed to develop so quickly in the space of about a year, in response to the urgent need of dealing with COVID. So, technologies are really critical, but it's not just technology. So I think, when we think more broadly, the way those technologies are managed is extremely important. There's been innovations in management all the way from Smith's Pin Factory to Taylor's scientific management to Toyota's lean manufacturing to global value chains. And these are all things, new ideas, which kind of helped improve productivity in the world. But there's also a sense in which many of these technologies by themselves don't create big increases of productivity. So the invention of electricity, here's the picture of Tesla's electricity. Paul David, the economic historian from Stanford, showed that it took many decades between the invention of electricity and seeing how that innovation translated through to real productivity growth. And the reason for that was that there had to be a lot of reorganization of the way people worked. So we had to invent factories which can now run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week with electricity, production lines which could create cars and other things very quickly. So there's a whole set of organizational changes which required better management in order to make best use of this technology. Another way of saying that is that firms can spend huge money on technologies to very kind of little effect. So, there's still a debate on, especially amongst economists, about how important management is. And this was brought home to me very vividly. There was a recent article saying, no potential driving factor of productivity has seen a higher ratio of speculation to empirical study. If you go around, this is the San Francisco bookshop. In those days when we used to be able to fly around, you can see there's lots of books here of Steve Jobs and Richard Branson. So these are really interesting, but they're kind of case studies. Only one observation. And this was really brought home to me when I was in the early stage of this research I was doing. I was working with McKinsey, who are a management consultancy firm. One of the partners was presenting his new book, and he was saying, well, this is an example of this fantastic firm he'd been working with the best management practices and very leading edge, and lots of other firms should copy it. And then as he was speaking, it transpired on us, he didn't say the name of the firm, but that the firm was actually Enron. And those of you who remember Enron, as he was speaking, unfortunately, the CEO of Enron was being dragged away by US Marshals for massive accounting fraud. So much so, in fact, people said you should change the sign of Enron from this sign to this sign, because this is how they actually treated the workers and their shareholders. So it's all to say that, basically it's very, case studies I used to teach at the business school are very useful to teach from, but to generalize, it's very hard to generalize from them. So in work that I've been doing with a number of different authors, particularly Nick Bloom from Stanford, but also Raphael San from Harvard over the last 20 years or so, we've been trying to more systematically collect data on management. I won't bore you with all the methodological details, but it's basically, looking at 18 core management practices on the collection and use of data, on setting targets, on how you deal with people, how do you involve them in decision making, do you take their ability and effort into account when you promote them or deal with underperformance. So really kind of basic things. We have ways of trying to interview people to get accurate responses from them by making it double blind, and we get pretty large samples to do this. So we have about 25,000 interviews across 34 countries in the world now. We started in manufacturing, and now we cover just about every sector of the economy. And we've got some pretty interesting results which come out of that line. If you're interested, you can download all the data. It's all anonymized but free to use from our website. Here's the kind of scores on the doors for different countries. So, these are kind of unsurprising. They kind of correlate quite highly with productivity. So the US is up there at the top with Japan, Germany, and Sweden. Other Western European countries, Ireland's kind of in the middle of the pack with the rest of Europe. As you go further down, you get emerging economies like Brazil and China. And at the bottom, you have poorer countries like Mozambique and Ethiopia. So, unsurprising at one level. What's kind of more interesting to me is that because we have the data within every country, we can look at the distribution across all firms of productivity. So if you compare the two leading countries in the world, the United States and the Republic of Ireland, what you see is this kind of pattern that, it's not the case that all American firms are, amazingly productive and well managed, and average Irish firm isn't. There's extremely well managed firms in Ireland and some very badly managed firms in the US. So these firms in the lower tail, as I mentioned before, are firms which are not really collecting data on what's happening in the firm. They're not dealing with underperformance. They're not setting sensible goals. And you can see those exist everywhere. But one of the big differences between, say, the US and the Republic of Ireland is Ireland has this much longer tail of less well-managed firms, which also have lower productivity. And just to show you that, this is just showing you the management data. If you correlate these management scores, so this is just puts all the scores into bins of 10 from the lowest to the highest decile, you can see a very strong relationship between management and productivity, but you can also see a strong relationship between management and profits or growth or exports or innovation. So these do really seem to matter at the micro level. And if you run this through some simple models and try and explain how much a macroeconomic performance this explains, it actually can do quite a lot. So this gray line is your total factor productivity, and I show you the growth. This is just the levels. You can see these are normalized. The US is 100, and every country is relative to the US. And you can see that from this, this orange line tells you how much of that productivity you can explain by management, and you can explain about a third. And in European countries, you can explain about a half with these management practices. So they matter both at the kind of firm level and also at the level of the economy as a whole. I have to say, one of the great things about this type of research is that you learn things you weren't expecting to. So, in the course of interviewing these thousands of managers, we got some pretty interesting quotes. So one of the things we do, as I'll show you, as we look at kind of multinationals, it actually turns out to be a little bit difficult to define ownership in Europe sometimes. One production manager told me, "We are owned by the mafia." And the interviewer there was extremely nervous and said, I think that's in the other category, although I guess I could put you down as an Italian multinational, which is how it was eventually coded in the data. Having lived in America for many years, Americans do well on productivity and well on management, but, they don't do well on everything. So, having a daughter who is the local government school in America, I worry about geography, because one of the interviewers said, "How many production sites do you have abroad?" And the manager in Indiana in the US said, "Oh, well, we have one in Texas," which, some people say that's the right answer. Texas is a different country. Okay, so we've got all this data. What are the drivers of management, and what policies can we think of? I mean, there's a number of them. I'll just give you a little bit of a taste of these. So one is on skills. So one of the strongest correlations we found with better management is the skills. So you might not be surprised to see that, the more educated managers, the higher the management score is in their firms. But interestingly, it's the same for workers as well. If you have a workforce which is well trained and well educated, that also is associated with better management scores. And it makes a lot of sense. It's very hard to get workers involved and trying to do continuous improvement if those workers are very badly trained and educated. So the first driver is kind of human capital. The second one, and this is very relevant to Ireland, is foreign direct investment. So it's kind of well established that multinationals are more productive, they pay higher wages. We also show that they have better management practices. They managed to transplant the practices overseas. So just comparing the US, France, and Ireland, you can see that although, for example, Ireland has lower management scores than the US, the management scores in the foreign multinationals are almost not quite as good, but almost as good. And you can see that multinationals appear to be very good at transplanting many of the managerial practices they have overseas, which helps productivity. One of the other things that we show is that the benefits of multinationals are not just getting the firm in, but they also help spread some of these benefits to other local firms. So this is from an American study where we compared a kind of treatment group by looking at plants in a county where a foreign multinational came in like Chota, and comparing that to a control county where, in this case, Tota had narrowed it down to, say, 3 different places. We can look at the just runners-up compared to the just winners and show that in the winning counties, there was a really big effect on productivity and management compared to the losing counties. So that just shows you, this graph is just showing you the increase in the management quality of the plants in the winning counties compared to the losing county after you had Toyota or other kinds of multinationals coming into the country, into the county. Information matters a lot. So we asked the question about how well managed that firms thought they were. Most firms think they're way better managed than the average, just the way we all think we're better drivers than the average. But we found that that was really not correlated with productivity or profits. And I think this shows you that it's very hard for people to self-assess. So we have this rigorous method of going in and trying to score management. A lot of people, just don't have good information on how well or how badly managed they are. So it shows you there's a role for improved information, benchmarking, in order to help improve firms' management scores. Competition also tends to be very important. So as you might expect, as suggested by the earlier graph, tougher competition weeds out the worst performing firms and also kind of gives incentives for firms to improve their management practices. Finally, there's an issue of governance. So if you look at the ownership types of firms, one of the interesting things is that family-owned firms where a family member runs the company tends to be less well managed than family-owned firms where you get professional managers in. Often the family owners, the firstborn or son or the eldest grandson of the founder, this kind of suggests that may not be the best way of trying to get the best person to run your firm, is just automatically assume it's your eldest son who should be the person who runs that firm. So let me finish with some ideas for a kind of a growth plan. I think there's kind of a couple of principles that we should think of when we think about what a growth plan should be. So in the short run, as we recover from COVID, there's an important question about how we balance the protection, which is necessary that we've had to give to firms and workers, with needing this reallocation into new industries and new resources. So we need to think, as we remove some of those protections and encourage that mobility, not to do that so quickly in a way that damages the economy. I mean, for Britain, for example, I think made a major mistake in doing that too quickly under austerity, and also to some extent in Europe as well. So we need to do that in a way, but a way which actually helps reallocation as well as giving protection. In the long run, we need to have policies towards innovation and management. I've given you some clues to that in my analysis. These need to be evidence-based. So if you're interested in the details, this report I did is for for the US, and I've done one for the UK. I'm working on one for Europe. For Ireland itself, I think there's many areas of strength. So I think the traditional model, which has managed to attract multinationals, especially US multinationals, is a real asset. Single market access I think, we need to deepen the single market to make it more competitive, but that is a big advantage. The young and diverse workforce, the open immigration policy, and the flexible labour market, these are all great strengths of Ireland. But of course, there's challenges. I think, as was mentioned, attracting multinationals is going to get harder, potentially with tax reform. But I think that many of these things will survive, because these things are independent of corporate tax rates. So it's not just about corporate tax rates, it's getting the environment right to attract multinationals. The disaster of Brexit is obviously something which is a challenge for all of us. It's going to hurt people in the UK the most, but it's going to have bad spillover effects to other countries, including Ireland. So, that is a definite challenge to be managed. We can talk about that. The third one is we have this long tail of underperforming firms. So there has to be some thought of how the long tail is brought up to improve things through some of the things perhaps I've mentioned, and also around governance as well. I would say in terms of innovation policy, given time is short, I won't go through the details, but mixtures of tax, government grants, particularly human capital supply. So I think, expanding the STEM workforce, universities, but also, one thing I think which is under-realized is that countries, like especially this is the US where I've worked most on, but also I think this is a more general thing. There's lots of potential inventors out there which are kept out of being inventors through barriers. Women, minorities, kids from low-income families. We showed in the US you could potentially quadruple the innovation rate by removing many of the barriers through poor schools and bad neighborhoods, exposing some kids who could become the inventors and entrepreneurs of the future to do that. And I think that would actually increase the pool of potential inventors, which could actually have very important long-run effects on our growth potential. So here's some various ideas for management, competition, trade, governance, managerial training and information. All of these we can maybe discuss. If you're interested, I have a couple of policy toolkits which we've written about both for innovation and also for management, assessing the evidence and giving a cost benefit, looking at the effects of time and also on inequality. But let me just conclude because I'm out of time. I think, just to end on, is this politically possible or not? So, I think the severity of the crisis that we faced before, but also during the COVID pandemic, gives an opportunity. I mean, often it's the case that when you've had this terrible negative shock, coming out of that, we can really make radical changes in our institutions and policies for the better. We saw that after the Second World War. And I think there's more of a political consensus now that we need investment in innovation, and the state has an important role in helping to rebuild society. So it's an opportunity, a moment for seeing how we can think about this growth plan of what can be done. There's a lot of evidence on what policies work and do not work. And I think really now's the time to move from words to action to get back to sustainable and equitable growth. So thank you very much, and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, John. Thanks very much for that. So a Marshall growth plan to get us back going again, and my MBA probably wasn't wasted, I hope. So next up I have Frances Ruane, who is chair of the National Competitiveness. That's a good, we need a better synonym for competitiveness, Frances, if you could work on that. National Competitiveness and Productivity Council. Frances is also an honorary fellow at TCD and a research affiliate at the SRI, where she formerly was director. And Frances also had a number of senior positions in Trinity College Dublin. Frances too has a long and outstanding career in public policy in terms of her roles and contributions. I think I had the pleasure of working with Frances when enterprise policy was industrial policy, Frances. So that takes us back a bit. But I'll hand over to you now, Frances.
Great, thank you very much indeed. And Maeve, if you maybe put up the first slide, that would be super. Maeve has very kindly agreed to move on the slides for me, so I'll be directing her as we go through. So thank you very much for the invitation to speak, and I really enjoyed John Van Reenen's presentation and the incredible coverage that he managed to get in that period of time. It was quite amazing. And what he did was, for me, he showed the link between economics and management. And I think it's historically one of the real gaps in economic research over the years, that we somehow or other left management in business schools and didn't really see how it connected in with mainstream economic thought. So I'm not going to provide any charts. I'm going to free ride on John's, so you can kind of relax your eyes for this period. I want to raise some issues that I think are relevant to the question of whether we need to rethink the research model. And then basically I'm going to be speaking in my capacity as chairman of the National Competitiveness and Productivity Council, which is even worse than National Competitiveness Council in terms of Aebhric's suggestion there. And I'll end with some personal comments. But let me start by looping back into a little bit into history, as John also did. So next slide, please, Maeve. Great. So the issue really, if we go back to let's go back to the very basics. In any society, whatever we're going to do in relation to growth and distribution depends on the values and objectives of the society, and they need articulation, and politics is how that comes about for the most part. And really, the role I think of economics is the economists is to analyze the consequences of some of those and feed into the process, but we're not the decision maker. So I think have a role to play in terms of the opportunities that are out there and the positive engagement with change. And John talked about that very extensively. I think is really important. The green innovation, in other words, responding positively to climate as opposed to articulating all the problems with addressing the climate agenda and with digitalization. And John again mentioned the role of policy in that process. And I think that's something which I think we've come to realize is more important than maybe was given credit for over a period of time. In Ireland, we've addressed a little bit of the risk question, I think, coming out of the financial crisis. I think it was a huge benefit to put in a national risk register when we did, but it's only a start, and focusing on risks alone is not enough. It's actually not going to get you where you need to go. So in terms of internationalization, I think we need a long-term approach, the extent to which we want to be proactive in that space, how we're going to engage with the EU, how we're going to engage with FDI companies that are here. And John mentioned a number of ways in which that could be important. If we then turn to number 3, the sort of focus on competitiveness and productivity, I mean, to me, competitiveness at the national level, kind of critical use of indicators to challenge ourselves. I don't think indicators give you a direction for policy, but they tell you where you should be looking to see where the issues are. There's competitiveness at the enterprise level, and that's really very much about productivity and the key role of innovation. So there's a sense in which, if I think back 30 years ago, innovation wasn't seen as mainstreamed in the way it is today. You're not going to survive today if you're not actually engaged in innovation. And then there's competitiveness at the public sector level. I think the pandemic has shown us that there are areas where the state is a vital player. And if we don't have a strong state, then we're not going to be able to manage those issues. And in other words, we need a good public sector system. If we're going down this direction of looking at a new model, we need to be willing to call out the weaknesses. And I think this is what Ken Whitaker did in the 1950s, what he did to call them out and then see how you might address them. So could I have the next slide, please, Maeve? So most of the audience here will be aware that Ireland had protectionist policies that ran from the 1930s to the 1950s. I think you can say we truly tested the infant industry hypothesis. We had among the highest rates of effective protection in the world, high tariffs, high quotas, and prohibitions on direct inward investment. So hence I call it extreme protectionism. And in the 50s, then we had just been having, after a century of population decline that had started with the famine, and we had wretched GDP growth performances and recurring balance of payments problems. So the values and objectives of that time centered on stabilizing the population, creating employment and promoting growth. And you ask yourself the question, what should they be today? So in terms of the policies that we have, it's pro-trade, pro-FDI, the export platform, which again, we were almost a first mover in the world in relation to that. We're certainly first mover in Europe by a long shot. I say we have excessive regional dispersal objectives, excessive in the sense that this wasn't something that would yield economies of agglomeration. It wasn't something that would give you potential clustering possibilities and the sort of spillovers that we now realize are so important. They were realized then, but it wasn't seen that putting factories in small towns was the way to achieve that. I think the ICT and pharma made a lot of sense because we were an island. You wanted high value to volume ratio products since we were going to be exporting them. And I suppose a particular thing about it is that our approach was very much enterprise driven, recognizing that in rural areas, there were not good facilities. So, and this is where a slight tricky part, I think, in terms of where policy maybe went on too long in a particular direction. The grants were there to kind of compensate you for those disadvantages, as opposed to dealing with the disadvantages themselves and addressing them. So we had a very slow reduction in protection. And I think that over a 15-year period, really, which I think helped to mitigate the disruption and prepare for replacement jobs. I think this is a huge contrast to what happened in the UK and the US in the 1980s. And John made a reference to some of what happened with austerity after the recent financial crisis. But it is really an issue of the importance of taking account of the risk of job scarring. So could you take the next slide, please, Maeve? So the key context changes then, which really have happened. We had a model, it has evolved, and as the external conditions have changed. So in the early days, we had investment, we actually looked for investment from other EU countries, and later that focus shifted to investment from the US and from others outside the EU. Basically, we were promoting ourselves as a production base within the EU, so going to other EU countries didn't make a lot of sense for investment, other than in some areas like financial services. The single market was a huge boom for all the small open economies in Europe. And as the trade constraints of the small market were removed, I don't think some people realize just how important that was for the small countries, not as important for the big countries because they already had scale. And of course, it required changes in our corporate tax system, which moved us all to the 12.5%. The other change that happened was the sort of financial globalization, which brought about the possibility for the Irish Financial Services Centre, and also trade and services, which gave us the possibility of engaging in that third industrial revolution that John referred to, namely building up a strong software sector. Global changes, growth in global value chains was an interesting one for Ireland because it brought opportunities, but the challenges it also brought was that we had intended and we had looked very much for local linkages between FDI and local sub-supply companies. And that actually was reduced because basically they could sub-supply from anywhere they wanted within Europe with no additional barriers other than the costs of moving materials. And as moving costs came down, that became more of an issue. So that may have affected the rate of diffusion over above what might have happened if they hadn't developed. And then, of course, there was the increased speed of innovation, which is a challenge precisely because we had not invested in the innovation system prior to the 1990s. And obviously that was a strong focus in John's talk. The focus also then came in on competitiveness, because up to that point, I mean, Aebhric referred to the fact that we did industrial policy. Well, actually, what we did was policy just looking at what we needed to support, as it were, enterprises, but we didn't look any wider. And the Culleton report really informed by Porter, really led us to move away from that and looking at the environment in which enterprise operates in a more holistic way, which I think was a huge benefit for coming back to the 1990s. Next slide, please, Maeve. Sorry, beg your pardon. Yes. So basically, what I list here is the global, basically challenges coming from three sources: global, European, and Irish. I mean, the global ones are ones you're all familiar with. I think COVID is interesting, and John mentioned that it was a test of agility, and we discovered we were more agile than we thought we could be. But that just said we weren't using the agility we had potentially there with the tools, technology tools that were available. It also upped the issue for Ireland of new ways of working and what it might mean for both spatial planning and for foreign direct investment. The European challenges, I think, that are around it that matter at the moment is the EU budget is going to the new priorities. It's going to addressing climate and it's going to addressing digital and data. So we need to be cognizant of that because, if you like, that's where the resource and the direction is going. And there's that real concern with productivity levels that John mentioned. And of course, there's Brexit, but that'll be discussed elsewhere this week. From an Irish perspective, again, there's a list that this audience will be quite familiar with. I think concentration of FDI needs to be looked at in a very careful way because it's a little bit like a portfolio. We happen to have the portfolio in the right place, but we recognize that portfolio is highly concentrated. The question is how to develop out of that portfolio and particularly address the low productivity tail in the SME sector, which is masked by the FDI performance if you look at the Irish economy in total. I personally see the planning issue as a huge challenge, and yesterday's seminar in this Dublin Economics Workshop made it very clear how difficulties we have in the spatial area, and in terms of organisational planning. Yesterday's news and the news in the last week, how the health sector demonstrates it also. So we have then the issue of managing, and John concentrated very strongly on this, the complexity of innovation and business. And that is demanding. I think Enterprise Ireland has been supporting investment and management for over a decade. So the question is whether the current approach is working as well as it might be, and it's just a question of scaling up, or whether there is a huge amount to be learned from the new research and literature that's out there, to which John referred. Next slide, please. So the next evolution, basically, what does it need to recognise? Well, basically, if you're thinking of a new enterprise strategy, and I think Ireland will be in the next while, we need to look at the international sectoral changes. And I list 3 there, which all need to be recognised. I think, and John touched on this as well, there's the issue of sort of economic values. After 40 years of an approach driven by focusing on GDP, and other metrics which have now come into question. We're looking very much at the beyond GDP debates and the issue of recognizing that income inequality has exploded, with consequent problems for areas, particularly acutely in Ireland, like housing. So I think that's something that needs to be taken into account. I think the pandemic has made people realize that a good set of public institutions and policies focused on well-being and equality and quality of life and the sustainability of the planet are important, and not merely the availability of cheap goods and services, which is effectively what's driven the globalization strategy for the United States over the last 4 decades. I think in Ireland, we started with the focus on job creation, and actually we've retained that. Back then it was to reduce immigration, but we've now had 25 years where we've had mostly net immigration. So a rapidly growing population following 100 years of emigration. So again, I think in the context of looking at a policy, we need to get a handle on what this means for how we think about the resources we share on the island. Because if you like, when you have a declining population, resources are not in certain kind of physical resources, not in scarce supply, but they come more so when you're growing. Next slide, please. So what would I say are the 6 things Irish enterprise policy needs to do? I think it needs to continue to evolve to accommodate the changing context we talked about. We need to ensure a consistent medium-term investment environment. One of the successes of Irish policy has been its consistency, because if it's not consistent over the investment timeframe of an FDI or of domestic firm that's trying to expand, it creates huge uncertainty. And I think it's a real role of government to increase certainty rather than reduce it. It needs to connect with the link up with other policy areas, and it's not just about the budgets for the relevant departments and agencies, it's about the other departments that interact. For example, the Department of Social Protection in how we're handling labour market issues. If that doesn't connect in with enterprise policy, then you can do one working against the other. Expertise is essential in terms of building up the expertise, drawing up the policies to allow us to look at key changing issues like health and digital data, logistics. And I think COVID has demonstrated that for Irish people very clearly. We need to continue to draw international expertise in, and John has made us an offer, which is great. And I think bringing it in the right place matters. So let me give you an example of what I think has been good in recent times. Has been the IDEA strategy was informed by an OECD paper, which in turn was informed by a lot of the types of research that John mentioned today. It wasn't the OECD setting strategy, which is what we've had happening in the past. And I think it's really important that you contextualize what the external information you have and external research that you have to put to bear. And then finally, you need to take account, as you might expect me to say, of competitiveness and productivity imperatives. So let's go to the next slide, please. So the Competitiveness Council was set up really to keep Culleton agenda on the radar. I think a lot of competitiveness issues lie outside the reach of the kind of department responsible for enterprise. So it's justice, environment, finance, social welfare, social protection. These departments all really matter a lot. Productivity got added to the National Competitiveness Council in recent times as a productivity role got assigned to each economy in the euro area. As part of that development, each country has to have a national productivity board. So rather than set up a new organization, the government decided to put it in with the National Competitiveness Council, which made a lot of sense. So that's now a much more direct attempt to deal with the productivity issue, which we've all been recognizing for the last 20 years has been a big issue for the developed OECD countries. So productivity issues are mostly related to enterprise, trade and employment, mostly in terms of what you would be doing. But the new department, for example, of higher education and research, it matters. The Department of Communications matters. and other crossover departments where, where we need to look at matters that do that. So what about our digital agenda, our digital strategy, I should say? Where is our digital strategy? And maybe John could actually help us with that particular topic, given his expertise. So the National Productivity and National Competitive Productivity Council continues to call out weaknesses and suggest policy actions. The problem has been that over the years, there were a huge number of actions suggested, sometimes up to 150. And an agreement in 2019 was that the annual challenge report would just focus on some areas and make some specific recommendations. So the advantage of that was the government now has agreed to publicly respond to how it is addressing these recommendations. And that happened for the first time last year in 2020 and will continue this year. So after the report is published, you basically get a feedback from the government a couple of months later on what it's going to do to address those actions. So if you just turn to the next slide, please. It's my second last slide. It's the challenge document is due out before the budget. It will have about 20 recommendations in it. This figure just gives you a kind of schematic view of some of the topics that it's focusing on this year. And you won't be surprised that flexible working is in there, that infrastructure is in there, particularly in relation to housing, and that human capital is in there specifically in relation to skills and innovation. And then on the cost competitiveness side, the key ones that are there are the ones that have a huge bearing, particularly on SMEs. Huge concern that it's the tail of the economy that has the greatest difficulty in dealing with present. So now if I turn to my last slide, please. So I suppose it's based on kind of watching the economy over 5 decades. And as I say, Culleton, I can't stress about how important it was from an economist perspective in putting the enterprise in the business environment in the total economy setting, and the need to have an efficient non-traded business sector surrounding it. So if you're doing something internationally, you need to move on to the next stage. Oh, sorry, Maeve. Next slide, please. If I didn't call that out, apologies for that. So Ireland, what does Ireland need? I think Ireland needs, and this resonate with earlier people who were on this DEW yesterday, a better approach to place. I think the world has suffered because place was not integrated into economic thinking as much as it should have been. We were all angels on the head of a pin for the most part in the way we thought about things, or we did things sectorally, we didn't do things geographically. Now, that's not to say that there weren't economic geographers and others, but it wasn't mainstreamed in LinkedIn. And I think Ed Glacier yesterday, it was a huge leading light in drawing those pieces together. So we have made some progress, and I think there's more to be made. So here's a really nerdy one. I think it's really urgent that we get accrual accounting into the Irish public sector. We're the only country in the EU without it. The UK, who we normally follow with a lag of a few years, started the process in the late 1970s on a big scale, and we still haven't moved on. And the problem with it means that resources such as land and buildings that are owned publicly are not properly accounted for. So I think that's a huge thing to do in the areas of the public service sector where it's not being done. I think another piece that would be useful is to make greater use of administrative legal processes for businesses. We have a legal system which we know is expensive, and it's challenging to deal with, and it's a huge potential impediment for SMEs in terms of where they want to go and reducing the burdens for them and facilitate both startups and wind downs. So during this reallocation period, you want to make sure that businesses are supported in what they need to do, not hindered. And then finally, because it always is the one that underpins a lot of this, is skills and education. And I think for Ireland to promote multiple educational pathways in a way more than is done, I think is needed. And hopefully, never not wanting to waste a crisis, some of that will come out of what has recently been experienced in the education system in relation to COVID. So thank you, I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Frances. Thanks very much. So we had a new Marshall Plan for growth, and Frances has given us some thoughts for possibly a new Telesis or a new Culleton or a new enterprise policy, just taking account of where we are and some of the challenges there. So our last set of speakers are led by Dermot Coates, who's Chief Economist with the Department of Employment Affairs and Social Protection. He's joined by Rory Geary, a colleague there, and also Adrian Hurley from the Department of Public Expenditure Reform, who are always there to keep us on our toes. These guys have an equally sterling list of contributions to public policy, but I'm going to be a little rude in the interest of time and address them collectively. As members of the Irish Government Economic and Evaluation Service, IGEES, we certainly in DEW think it's really important to have this public policy contribution in connection to the thinking from inside government, if you like. One of the lessons we learned from the last crisis, well, depending on whether you call that the one in 2008, was we needed better information and analysis, and certainly IGEES has provided plenty of that. And indeed, just to acknowledge, I think certainly in my part, the sterling work in terms of speed and agility that the civil service has responded in terms of the range of initiatives that have come out to support employment and to support firms. So I'm going to hand over to Dermot first, and then he'll take us through with his colleagues to the rest of the presentation. Over to you, Dermot.
Thank you very much, Aebhric, and thank you to the organisers for inviting us along here this afternoon. So I think, you know, when we're looking at this idea of rethinking the economic model as we hopefully exit this pandemic era, it provides a very good opportunity to look back on the path and the distance we have travelled actually these past 18 months. And specifically the fact that this has really been underscored by what Professor Reenen referred to as, you know, this period of radical change. And that radical change is not just how enterprises can go about their business actually against that backdrop of public health restrictions, which were hopefully behind us, but how they have gone about their business in an effort to meet the changing demands and preferences and behaviour of their consumers, but also how the role of the state has changed and the extent to which that has become enhanced, particularly in its interaction with the enterprise sector and with the labour market. And one very good example of that being the efforts in Q1 2020 to really erect a fiscal firewall around the labour market and to provide that level of support on a scale that was entirely unprecedented. And I think it is fair to say that in terms of the response of the state and its interaction with and contribution to the economy the macroeconomy more generally, that is a response that has been quite flexible and agile, but it's done at a level of speed and scale that we hadn't seen before. So one very good example of that is, you know, by May 2020, we had 1.2 million households in receipt of state income supports. Again, a scale that could not have been imagined even as we entered New Year 2020. But equally, the fact that the way we go about delivering those supports has changed, whether it's the, you know, adoption of a virtual way of working, but also, you know, just for instance, delivering social security supports that are linked to pre-unemployment earnings. Again, a change that wouldn't have been considered before, but is now becoming a feature of actually how we go about doing that. So I mean, again, this is very much underscored by that kind of radical change and very much an enhanced role for the state. And again, just to cite one of Professor Van Reenen's contributions, you know, again, it's underscored by this concept of policy urgency. And what we've seen in terms of strategic policy formulation is that's something that's changed very rapidly over this period, and there are very firm and solid examples of that, whether it's the Economic Recovery Plan or the National Employment Strategy, both of which have been deployed only in the last few weeks. And again, touching on Dr. Ruane's points, you know, they again reflect, you know, multiple educational channels as we focus around further education and training, apprenticeships, etc. So that, you know, our ambition is not simply to recover the ground that has been lost over these past 18 months and to do so very, very quickly, but to prepare for future challenges. So again, as I said, that level of change that we've seen in real time over the past 18 months and the scale to which we can be agile and responsive is seen very much through those supports to enterprise in the labour market. So we will segregate this particular work as we go forward. So my colleague Adrian then will look specifically at those enterprise supports, and then we'll move on to our colleague Rory, who will look specifically at the labour market supports. So at that then I'll hand over to you, Adrian.
Very good, thanks Dermot. Just move on to slide here. Okay, thanks Dermot. Yeah, so I'm going to discuss the enterprise section of this presentation. And what I'm going to look at is a recent spending review paper that we published recently, which looked at the analysis of the distribution of enterprise supports. So looked at how enterprise supports are distributed across our economy at a regional, at a sectoral and at a firm level. So first of all, on the right-hand side here, you'll see the main enterprise agencies that we cover in the paper. So we have Enterprise Ireland, who focus on our exporting businesses in Ireland. We've IDA Ireland, who focus on inward investment. And then we've our local enterprise offices, who focus on the micro enterprise and startups. And underneath that, what you'll see is some of the main supports that these enterprise agencies cover. So with Enterprise Ireland, you can see one of the main focuses for them is on the seed and venture capital fund. So that's investing in early stage startups in Ireland. For IDA Ireland, it's around research and development grants and also investing in properties around the country to attract inward investment to those areas. For the local enterprise offices, then it is around startup grants and also expansion grants. Just to note that there's obviously other ways that the government also currently support the enterprise model in relation to taxation. So again, Professor Reenen would have discussed research and development, tax credits and so forth. So they would be covered under taxation. Also areas such as skills development, labour market policy, which my colleague Rory will discuss, and also areas such as investment in infrastructure. So I suppose what this paper gives us a good understanding is of the current supports that the government provide, and then it gives us, I suppose, an understanding if we are to move to a new economic model or so forth, well, you know, what current policies we have, and do these need to change, or do we need to reprioritize within these different enterprise agencies? Okay, so the first area that we looked at is we looked at how the supports are distributed at a regional level, and we looked at the county level. So these are the counties in Ireland, and this is these are percentages. Okay, so the first graph that we see here is when we took IDA, Enterprise Ireland, and local enterprise offices together. And what you can see here is that 32% of enterprise supports in value terms is going to Dublin, 13% is going to Cork, 8% going to Galway, 6% Limerick, 4% Waterford. So they're our main cities. And then the rest of the counties, between 1% and 3% of enterprise supports are going there. And what we find in the paper is that this distribution of enterprise supports is actually very similar to how our overall enterprise base is distributed. And also, in fact, how our population in the country is distributed. The distributions are very similar, and we cover that in the paper. However, when we look then at the enterprise agencies in isolation, we do see some differences. So first of all, if we look at Enterprise Ireland, who I said are focused really on our exporting businesses, what you'll see here is that just under 50%, so 48% of supports are going to between Dublin and Cork. Okay, and this is very similar to how their enterprise clients are distributed. Okay, so there's not much difference between how their supports are distributed and actually how their clients are distributed across our country. However, for IDA Ireland, then what you do is you do see a difference between how their client base is distributed and how their supports are distributed. So for example, 55% of IDA clients are located in Dublin. However, 21% of supports are distributed there. Okay, so they have a much bigger focus on some of our other cities, such as Cork, where 17% of their supports go there, Galway 13%, Limerick 11%, and Waterford 6%. With the local enterprise offices, then what you will see is relative to the other enterprise agencies, what you see is that they have a less focus on Dublin, so they have 19% in Dublin. However, they have also bigger focus in around areas such as the Midlands here relative to the other enterprise agencies. And again, the local enterprise offices, how their supports are distributed is very similar to how their actual client base is distributed. The second area we looked at then was the sectors that the agencies focus on. And for this, we just looked at Enterprise Ireland and IDA Ireland, as the sectoral data wasn't available for the local enterprise offices. So if we look here on the left-hand side first, what we see is that there's three really main sectors that the enterprise agencies are supporting. That's manufacturing, information and communication, and finance and insurance. And as you'll see, for both enterprise agencies, manufacturing is the sector that is supported the most. So on the right-hand side, then we look at, okay, within manufacturing, what are the industries that are being supported? And again, I suppose to look at this, we will focus on the agency separately, because we can see clearly that the sectoral focus of Enterprise Ireland and IDA Ireland is quite different. So if we focus first on Enterprise Ireland, the green bars, what you'll see is just under 50% of payments made by Enterprise Ireland is going to the food products and beverages sector. However, then if we look at IDA Ireland, we can see that their sectoral focus is quite different. So over 80% of payments made by IDA Ireland is going to other manufacturing and chemicals and pharmaceuticals. And again, within other manufacturing, then this is really being driven by medical devices. Okay, so over 80% of IDA grants are going to the medical devices and pharmaceuticals industries. So the third aspect then that we looked at is the firm level. Okay, so we looked at firm size and also ownership. So if we concentrate on the left-hand side here first on the firm size, what we'll see is the green bars is the value of payments. So if we take the total quantum of payments being made by IDA, EI, and local enterprise offices, and we looked at how that was distributed across the economies, across each firm size. And as you'll see is what the relationship is that it increases with the firm size. So the largest value, so just over 30% of our total support payments are going to large enterprises in the value of payments. And intuitively, I suppose this does make sense. If you think about it, if I'm a large enterprise, I'm more than likely going to be taking on a much larger project relative to a micro enterprise who might just be starting up. However, if we look at the number of payments then, so the number of firms in each firm size receiving support, what we'll see is that the relationship is actually in reverse. So it decreases with firm size. So just over 40% of all firms who receive support are in the micro level, so this red bar here. And again, intuitively, this would make sense because in the paper, what we look at is we compare this to the distribution of the actual enterprise base. And of course, as most of us will know, we have a lot more micro businesses relative to the other firm sizes. So this does make sense. And again, in the paper, you'll see that this does differ across different agencies. So if we take someone like the IDA, they have a much bigger focus on medium and large enterprises. Whilst if we take someone like the local enterprise offices, they'd be focused primarily here on the micro enterprise. As I said, that is covered in the paper. On the right-hand side, then, what we see is the ownership. So we look at Irish versus non-Irish owned firms. And if we look at the number of payments first, what you'll see is this red bar here. You'll see that when we look at the three agencies and we look at who's been supported, 90% of firms who are being supported are Irish owned. Okay. However, when we look at this in the value terms, then the differential between Irish and non-Irish reduces. So although 90% of firms who are supporting are Irish owned, just less than 60% of the actual value of payments are going to Irish owned firms. And again, looking at the different agencies in isolation helps us to understand this. So the non-Irish owned firms are mainly agencies of the or clients of IDA, and those firms tend to be larger in size. So for example, the average payment that's going to a non-Irish owned firm is 240,000, while the average payment going to an Irish owned firm is 35,000. So although there's less support or number of firms receiving support, the value of the payment going to them is much larger. So this is a high level overview of the main results we found from the spending review paper, but it can be found online along with all other previous or recent published spending review papers if anyone does want to read it in more detail. I'll hand over now to my colleague Rory, who will go through some of the labour market supports.
Thanks, Adrian. So now that Adrian has given a little bit of empirical context into what Ireland's economic model has been in the recent past, with the next few slides, I'm planning to talk through some of the income supports which were put in place by government over the past year and a half. And through this, what we're doing is as Dermot said in the intro, we're providing a demonstration of how the Irish government has changed its economic model at a very substantial scale and at a very rapid pace in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So we can illustrate that quite clearly with this first slide. And here we're showing the evolution of labour market income supports over the 18 months of the pandemic. So in March 2020, for anyone who's not familiar with these, the red bars here refer to the live register. So here we're including the typical unemployment benefits that were available pre-pandemic. Then the dark green bars are the pandemic unemployment payment. This was a weekly payment available to anyone who lost their jobs due to the pandemic. And then the gold and silver bars are the wage subsidy schemes. So these were similar in nature, except they retained the connection to employers by being paid through the employer's payroll. So there's a couple of things to point out in this graph. The first is the scale. If you look at May 2020, we can see that at the peak of the pandemic and these schemes, there were over 1.2 million people being supported by one form of income support or another. And just to put that in context, Ireland's labour force prior to the pandemic was around 2.4 million people. So we had close to half of the pre-pandemic labour force having their incomes supported by government. Also, what's notable is how the numbers of people reliant on one type of income support really fluctuated with the severity of restrictions that were placed on the economy. So as things reopened in summer 2020, we can see numbers declining before rising again as more restrictions were imposed in the winter just past. However, we can see the many businesses did manage to adapt because we never hit that initial peak from May 2020 again in 2021. And now we can see that the economic recovery is certainly underway. With PUP in particular, there's been a very precipitous decline in numbers claiming PUP, and we have fallen from our 2021 peak of around 486,000 to this week's figure is just over 115,000. So if you could move to the next slide, please, Adrian. Now, taking a quick look at how these income supports were distributed across sectors, it's somewhat of a reversal to the sectoral distribution that Adrian has just gone through in terms of enterprise supports. So if we look at how the PUP and the wage subsidy scheme were divided up across sectors in the Irish economy, it was very much heavily skewed towards domestic focused sectors. These were customer-facing businesses, and they used a relatively lower level of technology. So it was much less feasible for them to work remotely, or indeed not possible. On the right-hand axis here, what we're showing is the percentage of the pre-pandemic employment level which was being supported by either the PUP or the EWSS at the peak in 2021. And I'll just emphasize that these aren't necessarily precise statistics. What we're doing is we're summing the weekly peak figure from 2021 for PUP to a monthly peak figure for EWSS, because you need to look at the wage subsidy scheme in monthly instead of weekly figures. And then if we just put that as the numerator over the employment level that we saw prior to the pandemic, again, it really highlights the scale of government intervention in the labour market over the past year and a half. If we perform this calculation, we can see almost the entire accommodation and food sector was being supported by government at one stage or another, and also very high levels of support for the construction sector and the other sectors, which here includes things like hairdressers, personal care, etc. So moving on to the next slide. Taking a quick look at how these supports were distributed across the country then. In terms of absolute size, Dublin's dominance is very apparent here. It's just an order of magnitude larger in terms of influence in the Irish economy than any other region. However, if we relativize that by the size of the pre-pandemic labour force in each region, which is what's represented by the gold dots here, the differences are much less stark. So Dublin still comes out on top with about 40% of its pre-pandemic labour force in terms of size being supported by PUP or the wage subsidy scheme in January or February of this year. And the other regions, we saw between 28 to roughly 33% of pre-pandemic labour forces being supported by these income schemes. And the reason we did a little bit of internal analysis into why Dublin comes out differently. And it's because Dublin has somewhat of a unique economic structure compared to the other regions. So Dublin suffered from a loss of business travel, a loss of tourism related to sports events, concerts. In terms of the staycations, which were replacing foreign holidays, Dublin would have suffered more than some of the more rural areas in the country. And also, somewhat unique to Dublin, there's a huge administrative and support services sector. So a lot of businesses are set up to support offices, security, office cleaning, all the retail and food, etc., which lost out on the volumes of office workers traveling to the city every day. So moving on to the last slide then, please, Adrian. So that was just a very quick overview of the size of government intervention and the scale of supports that government provided to the labour market over the past year and a half. Now, going forward, we are in the midst of an economic recovery, and government has set out a significant policy response to this. And these are detailed primarily in the Economic Recovery Plan, which was published this past June, and that was followed by Pathways to Work in July, which detailed some of these policies in greater detail. So overall, there's a lot of ambition within these policies, these strategies. So overall, there's a target to have 2.5 million people in work by 2024. And that would be the largest employment level that Ireland had ever had if that target is achieved. And then within Pathways to Work itself, which is focused on helping unemployed people and more disadvantaged groups back into the labour force, some of the notable policies is the Jobs Plus scheme. This provides very substantial grants of up to €10,000 for employers who hire people off the live register. There has also been a new work placement experience program launched, and this has 10,000 placements. And really the goal of this is to help people to gain valuable experience. And with that in mind, there is a requirement for employers to provide participants with sector-specific training and with relevant accredited training. And then lastly, and very quickly, I'll just point out that there has been a lot of funding put in place for further and higher education by government. So government is seeking to help people to upskill and reskill, and as part of that, there is awareness and effort to anticipate emerging sectors and emerging technologies. So some of these courses will be targeted at, for example, retrofitting green retrofits of housing, or IT and digital skills more broadly. So that is the end of our presentation. Again, what we were trying to get across is just to provide some empirical context into what Ireland's economic model has been, what roles government has played in recent years, and how the government has pivoted and responded to a truly historic economic shock over the past 18 months. So thanks everyone for listening, and we're happy to take any questions that anyone might have.
Great, and keep those questions coming on the question and answer function through Zoom. Okay, I have a few questions which have come in through the box already, so I might put the first set to John and to Francis. I think you can pick up on these. The first one is there was a discussion about productivity, which is a question about its measurement, reliability, manufacturing productivity, services productivity. In Ireland, for example, John, we debate about construction productivity and how we can get more out of the construction sector in particular. So there's a measurement question and maybe a general question about how you can sort of improve productivity in those spaces. Also, and Francis might want to pick up on that, but also a second question to both of you. One of the areas you talked about is this transfer, which is of big interest to us, between a foreign multinational and local indigenous enterprise in terms of management skills. I think that'd be a particular interest. We always tend to cite, I think it's Digital, isn't it? So Digital was a company that disbanded in Galway, and all the staff went up and set up a business basically in extremis, and that gave us a huge boost. But maybe you might care to talk about that a little more in terms of the hows of how that maybe how it happens and how we can improve it. And Francis, you may also care to comment on exactly that, if you like, how we can maybe improve those synergies and linkages between the very successful FDI sector we have and indigenous enterprise. So over to you, John, first.
Sure. Well, thank you for those questions. I've been trying to answer some of them in the Q&A, but it's hard to do that live. Yeah, measurement is definitely a huge issue here. It's, productivity is difficult. It's difficult to measure, and as more of the weight of the economy moves into the harder to measure sectors, the kind of digital sectors, the internet sectors where many goods are given away free, as well as service sectors, it does pose definite challenges. My take on this is that there's always been problems of measuring productivity. There's always been as well understood problems of how you measure quality change, increases of varieties, and so on. And although we're learning all the time, there's been a lot of improvement. So I think that some of the slowdown in productivity could be due to mismeasurement, but people have really dug into this, have found that it can't explain all of the fall. And a particular example is, if you look after the global financial crisis, we've had this very big effect and a big fall of productivity before and after the global financial crisis. It's hard to believe that suddenly all the mismeasurement problems jumped up, particularly in 2008 and 2007. So though I do think productivity explains the measurement plays some of it, I think, you know, a lot of this stagnation is actually real. Then in terms of your question over particular sectors and what can be done, I mean, I guess, you know, there's the general policies I talked about, and you know, I'd say it's going to be very much depending on the particular sector or the particular country you're looking at. My sense of construction, we've done some work in the UK actually, and the management of construction is particularly poor compared to other sectors. And anecdotally, my sense is that part of this may be to do with, you know, lots of parts of construction are very, you know, there's lack of labor standards, lack of skills, a lot of very, you know, small businesses running these things. So my sense is that some of the problem is to do with a lack of kind of skills and training in many of these sectors, and that's one factor which could be used to think about these things. So that would be I could keep on going, but I'll probably pause that for answers.
And maybe just tease the linkages between multinationals and indigenous. Just you talked about in one of your examples this transfer of knowledge. If a big business set up in a small town, you get this sort of transference. Is there any understanding of how that happens?
Yes,
and how to make it better?
Totally. So the thing, I mean, there's lots of mechanisms through that with how that can happen. One thing that we found was particularly important, actually wasn't necessarily being in the same industry, but it was whether there was a lot of labor market flows. So we found that the biggest effects of transference happened in those industries where the managers were moving from one firm to another. So, you know, if the managers could move, they could actually bring some of the knowledge that they had with them from one place to another. Some of the, you know, ways of continuous improvement, ways of working. So having a good flow of managers and workers as well is one of the best ways actually to spend knowledge. So your example of digital was an interesting one. So maybe that was one where, you know, the firm closed down, and that's an extreme example, but they could learn from some of the mistakes they made and some of the knowledge they had to set up the new firm. So that's a very extreme example, but it shows you how, you know, the mobility of people across different businesses is one of the ways, you know, having a flexible labor market is very important for having that flow of knowledge happening smoothly.
Thank you, John. Francis, so the same to you. Obviously, with the NCPC title as well, productivity is something we're now having a greater focus on. So I have this kind of sectoral question about different sectors, if you have any comment, and also this transference piece, the linkages between foreign owned and indigenous, which is the way we describe them, but that's a crude measure at the best of times.
So I just want to start off by agreeing with what John said about, you know, this challenge of measuring productivity is hard. And I remember Robert Gordon at a seminar, a Eurostat seminar in I think 1998, beginning to talk about this difficulty of productivity thing on a wide scale. So this issue has been recognized for quite a long time. And there's a lot of work being done at the OECD and Eurostat and the UN and the various different bodies in trying to get a better understanding and using modelling to break things out, but you know, break the different effects out. But I think, as John said, it doesn't fully explain really what's happened. There's also this issue of whether there's a lag before a productivity effect is there. So if you do something, certainly from a policy intervention point of view, you might expect it a while to be there with the productivity. Big question at the moment is what's going to be the effect on productivity of people working from home. Is that going to be a positive or a negative? And some of John's colleagues have been involved in research looking at that. What would be the effect of that a year out, 2 years out, 5 years out? So some of these things are really very important things to take into account. In relation to Ireland, I mean, the CSO has put a huge investment in the last 5 years, I think pushed by my predecessor on the National Competitiveness Council, Peter Clinch, to invest more in the productivity statistics. They're doing a lot. They're publishing an annual release on productivity, but there's a lot more to be done. And what's really needed is the kind of in-depth research that underpins understanding how this works together at the level of the individual enterprise, but also at the level of the system. And I'm sort of, you know, long enough in the tooth to remember when academics wouldn't engage at all for the most part, with companies in Ireland. And then they gradually did it with maybe the big FDI companies. Now that's much more widespread. So that was a loss of a possible transfer into the system over a longer period of time. So I think that's got much better. And, you know, your story about digital is interesting, because that would have been a late 70s, early 80s piece. But at a much earlier stage, somebody did analysis a number of years ago, which came to show that virtually all of the owners of companies in that type sector in Ireland had all come out of General Electric, which had been an investment in the 60s, where they took people out to the States. So there was a massive investment in management of key people who then went on to be, you know, the CEOs of many of the multinationals that came in and some of the domestic firms that emerged in the sector. So this issue of spillover, as I said in my own address, that it's the direct one through contact with companies is probably loosened because of the global value chain issue, but some of these other ones are ones that can be built on, and this is actually where policy can make a difference. You know, we've talked about it for, I think, about 30 years now, and it was sort of, you know, the innovation system and trying to improve it, but it's a slow burner, and I think we're making the right strides. I think it has been recognised. What needs to happen, though, is that builds in with the other policies that are around it, and it just doesn't stay, as it were, on its own.
Okay, I might ask a question of Adrian and maybe Dermot, just or possibly Rory. Adrian, I was interested in the data for LEOs, for example, which differed. So the rest for the IDA and EI showed an agglomeration around cities, basically, which is where a lot of the firms were and a lot of the people were, but the LEOs is more distributed. Does that mean there's more innovation happening in the Midlands, or is there another factor that might explain that? And then perhaps to all of you, certainly, you know, the great thing about COVID, he said, is that actually it gave us some great data, right? So you really now have a lot of information about what's going on in firms and about the labour market in some ways. So I wonder if you have any general observations about things that might surprise us from looking at the numbers and seeing how COVID has influenced them. So over to Adrian first.
Yeah, very good. Thanks, Aebhric. In relation to the LEOs, I suppose the way the LEOs are set up is that they're in each county council and so forth, but also that they focus primarily on micro enterprises. So what you will find is that there's a more spread of micro enterprises across the country, rather than, you know, there's a more Dublin would be home to a lot of medium and large enterprises, which is the focus of IDA, and medium and small will be Enterprise Ireland. So I suppose it's just the way the enterprises are actually distributed across the country. There's a lot more micro enterprises spread across the Midlands and so forth, and therefore that's a focus of the local enterprise offices. So that's why we see a greater a spread there. I suppose what is important to understand is that the IDA and Enterprise Ireland, the quantum of payments that they would be paying to companies is a lot larger than the local enterprise offices as well. So I'm not saying that the LEOs are more important for these areas or anything like that. The quantum that IDA or EI could be higher than the LEOs. It's just how they're distributed. But how we're seeing that distribution is really down to the distribution of the enterprise base, and that there's more micro enterprises and so forth around those the Midlands area relative to medium and large enterprises, which would be a focus of the IDA.
Thanks, Adrian. Dermot, do you want to comment just, or maybe there's some other observations?
Yeah, just in the first instance, Aebhric, I think your point on data and the use of data is very well made. I mean, specifically what you would have seen is from the time the pandemic unemployment payment was launched last March, there's been numerous iterations of actually refining that and being able to relink people's payment rates to pre-pandemic earnings by virtue of reshaping incentives to work once the labour market had reopened. And that really much is testament to the work that has been done to link in integrated systems effectively between the Social Security Administration and the tax system. So actually you have that robust real-time data that allows you to do policy design very much on that evidential base. And I think that's something quite different, but that's something we would be keen to retain as we move beyond it and some of the key learnings. And I think it's also important to bear in mind, sometimes when we listen to the commentary for the 3 lockdown periods, which are hopefully well in the past now, the reference seemed to be constantly that the labour market was locked down and was frozen solid. But actually, if you look at the data we would have published, you can see there are strong inflow and outflow week on week. So even in a period where we were seeing net increases, we were still seeing outflows as people returned to work. And just to flag that is an area that we're interrogating at the moment, specifically looking at areas of transitions back to work and welfare, so we can track, and again with this real-time, highly granular micro data, where people are returning to work. Are they returning to work as they exit PUP to their previous employer? Are they going back to the same sector? Are they changing sector? Are they changing employer? And that's of a level of depth that I don't think that we really would have been able to do in the past. But again, in the same way as these type of asymmetric shocks tend to accelerate underlying trends within an economy in terms of the type of work we want to do, it has kind of forced the pace in terms of what we need to be able to do in our own capabilities. And I think there's certainly something very positive from that we'll carry forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Dermot. John, I might just give you one more question because we're at 28 minutes past. I'll just say to everyone, by the way, that the slides will be available afterwards on our website. So thanks to all the contributors there. But John, the question of taxation came up in a very specific way through the chat box. So in terms of family firms, your evidence seems to show that families themselves don't necessarily tend to run a business very well. If they have an independent CEO, they tend to be run a bit better. But we've rather generous inheritance taxes here. So you may care to comment on that. But also perhaps a wider question about taxation and innovation and productivity. You know, there are wider questions here. Our capital gains tax, for example, here is very high compared to the UK. So, you know, what are the tax policies that better promote productivity?
Okay, all in 1 minute. So in inheritance tax, you know, I wouldn't give big breaks to family firms for inheritance tax because, you know, why distort the tax system to encourage family firms if they don't actually add much to productivity or management? And by giving all these tax breaks, you actually you decrease social mobility because you're giving, you know, extra advantages to, you know, to relatively wealthy young people, and you're also losing taxation. So I think that's not a good idea. I think more generally, when you think about the tax system, you know, the best kind of tax system I think should be certain, reliable, you know, not with lots of, you know, too many fiddly breaks here or there. I think for R&D, you should have an R&D tax credit, I think, as Ireland does and most countries do, because there are benefits for research and development. So I think that makes a lot of sense. I think in terms of stimulating innovation, though, I wouldn't say tax is the main thing. I would put a bigger emphasis on the things I mentioned briefly about trying to create the right environment for innovation, get the other things right about markets, so get the financial system funding startups and helping growing firms, going for human capital, getting, you know, good quality people going through universities, releasing some of the barriers to the potential inventors. So those are the things, the supply side I'd emphasize more than the thing around with the tax system. Very quickly, I just, in terms of your question about, you know, what have we learned from COVID? I think the positive lessons, and we have learned we can be very agile and innovate. I think the vaccine example is a wonderful example of how the human race managed to take on the biggest problem we faced, and within a short space of time generated vaccines which hopefully have helped lift us out. That's a very positive story. In the micro side, there's been lots of examples of adopting new technologies, digital technologies to work from home like we're doing now, and also, you know, to sell more things online. So I think there's been lots of agility from a macro level and a micro level. I hope we can build on that going out of the pandemic to kind of help build our economies better.
Thank you, John. So my thanks to all the participants, everyone, all attendees, and also to our speakers, Professor John Van Reenen, Francis Ruane, Adrian Hurley, Rory Geary, and Dermot Coates. And thanks to all my colleagues. Tomorrow we have a double bill. So it'll be a really good session at 1 o'clock on climate change and biodiversity, and at 3 o'clock we have a session on the public finances. So you can tune in for those tomorrow and register at dublineconomics.com if you haven't already. So it'll be the Godfather 1 and 2 tomorrow afternoon for your leisure. My thanks to everyone again, and looking forward to seeing you at another session. And John, we'll have you over, I'm sure, in the future over to Ireland as soon as we can. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.